The sun was setting over the fertile fields of Goshen, tinting the horizon with a gentle amber glow. The land was quiet, save for the rustling of grain and the distant voices of children at play. It was a land of promise, yet also a land of sorrow. Here, the descendants of Abraham had settled. They were called the Hebrews, a people chosen by God, growing in number, strength, and faith. Even in the midst of slavery, their joy seemed to multiply just as quickly as their children. Their laughter echoed through the campfires, and each new birth was treated as a divine gift, one more thread in the story God was weaving. But their increase did not go unnoticed. In the golden palace of Egypt, the Pharaoh, ruler of the most powerful empire on earth, regarded the Hebrews with narrowed eyes. "They have grown too strong," he said to his advisors. "If war breaks out, they may join our enemies and escape from the land." Fear had entered Pharaoh's heart, and with it, the seed of cruelty. So, Pharaoh enslaved the Hebrew people, forcing them into harsh labor, building cities, working the fields, being pushed to exhaustion under the scorching Egyptian sun. Yet, strangely enough, the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. Pharaoh's fear deepened into hatred. A new decree echoed through the land. Every boy born to the Hebrews must be thrown into the Nile. But every girl may live. A chill swept through the households of Goshen. Mothers wept. Fathers trembled. Pregnant women clung to their bellies with prayers they had never prayed before. The humble huts of Goshen became sanctuaries of whispered faith and silent tears. Still, the Hebrew people did not bend. They had been enslaved, but they would not be broken. Their only hope, their silent strength, was God, and among them were the women, strong, resolute, courageous. Women who carried life into a world that was trying to crush it. In the shadows of Pharaoh's fear, faith was being born. Morning light glimmered faintly over the encampment in Goshen, but there was no cheer in the air. Rumors spread like desert winds, swift and dry, scratching the hearts of all who heard them. Word had come from the palace. Pharaoh, the heartbeat of Egypt, had spoken a dreadful command. Every Hebrew boy born from this day forward was to be thrown into the Nile. The order was clear. Ruthless. Final. The hearts of mothers grew heavy. Expectant fathers trembled at the thought of cradling a son they might never get to keep. In homes built from mud and straw, the cries of the unborn mingled with the unspoken prayers of their parents. Yet, in the midst of this storm, two women stood taller than most. Shiphrah and Puah, midwives of Israel. They were not queens or prophets. They carried no staff, commanded no army. But they carried something far more dangerous to the enemy, the fear of the Lord. Shiphrah was older, with a face lined by years of tireless work and the wisdom of many births. Her hands had caught the first cries of hundreds of children. Puah, younger but just as skilled, moved with quiet confidence. Her eyes were bright, watching every detail, attentive to every mother in her care. Together, they made a vow that day. "We will not be silent partners to death. We are partners of life." They knew the consequences. Pharaoh was not a man to be ignored. His word was life or death. Yet the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of promise, was greater still. Their work became sacred in a new way. Every time they entered a home, their noses filled with the scent of incense and sweat, their ears met with the heavy breathing of laboring women, and their hearts beat in time with the rhythm of birthing pains and whispered psalms. One night, they were called to the home of a young woman named Naamah. Shadows danced on mud walls as Shiphrah and Puah crouched beside her, their hands steady, their spirits calm. The baby came quickly, as though eager to greet the world. A boy. His tiny fists waved in the air, his lungs filled with the breath of life. Naamah wept, not from pain, but terror. She gazed at her son as if memorizing every feature, every sound. "What will become of him?" she whispered. Puah gently placed a finger over her lips. "Only God decides that," she said. Shiphrah held the child close, her wrinkled hands steady but her spirit trembling with prayer. "Lord, you are the keeper of Israel. Hide this child in your wings." The baby's cry quieted as he nuzzled into the blanket. Shiphrah and Puah exchanged a silent look. They knew what they had to do. They would not hand him over. They would not obey Pharaoh. The God of life had spoken louder in their hearts. Slowly, quietly, they slipped into the night, making their way to a safe hiding place. This was not the first child they saved. And it would not be the last. But soon, Pharaoh heard whispers that his command was not being obeyed. The sandals of a royal messenger stirred the dust of Goshen. Men in armor marched through the narrow paths between Hebrew homes. Fear knotted around the hearts of the people like a tightening rope. One morning, as Shiphrah and Puah were washing their hands in a clay basin, they heard the pounding on their door. The soldiers had come. Pharaoh summoned them to the palace. The journey was long and quiet. Puah's heart pounded like a drum. Shiphrah hummed a psalm under her breath, her voice thin but unwavering. They were escorted into the grand halls of Egypt, a place of marble and gold, where music once played but now only cold silence reigned. Pharaoh sat on his throne, robed in linen, crowned with gold, eyes sharp as blades. "Why have you let the boys live?" he demanded. The question cut through the air like a spear. Puah glanced at Shiphrah. They had rehearsed their answer, but still, her breath trembled. Shiphrah stepped forward, voice steady. "The Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women," she said. "They are vigorous and give birth before the midwife arrives." A murmur followed. Pharaoh's eyes narrowed. But whether he believed them or not, the truth was this: God's favor was upon them. They had spoken truth with faith. They had done what was right. Pharaoh dismissed them, his eyes still stormy, but his hands tied by his own decree. Shiphrah and Puah left the palace with their heads held high. They had risked their lives for the sake of others. They had chosen the fear of God over the fear of man. And because of this, God smiled. As the sun rose again over Goshen, a quiet joy filled the camp. Babies still cried. Mothers still sang. Life continued to bloom in defiance of death, and somewhere in Egypt, a plan beyond imagination was already unfolding. The cry of one baby being saved would eventually lead to the salvation of a nation, but that story was still to come. For now, the midwives walked in peace, knowing that God rewards those who stand for what is right. And because the midwives feared God, He gave them families of their own. Exodus 1 verse 21. Their legacy was being written, in the womb of time. The palace was now behind them, the threat of Pharaoh echoing in their minds, but the fire of faith burned brighter still. Shiphrah and Puah walked back into Goshen, sand shifting beneath their feet, thankful to once again feel the dust of their people, the scent of home, and the quiet laughter of children the world tried to silence. The two midwives were not just medical helpers, they were guardians of life, defenders of God's promises, and now, quiet rebels in a divine revolution. Every step they took felt like walking on holy ground. The night after their return, they were called to the home of an elderly Hebrew woman named Jochebed. She was seasoned with both years and sorrow. Already a mother to 2 children, God was now growing another life in her that would soon rewrite the destiny of a nation. The room was dimly lit with oil lamps. Shadows danced on clay walls as Jochebed labored through waves of pain. Her husband, Amram, paced outside, whispering prayers under an ebony sky. Shiphrah knelt by the birthing mat, her hands gentle on Jochebed's back. God is with you, she murmured, her eyes glowing like embers. Puah brought hot water, herbs, and cloth. Every movement was filled with purpose, swift, steady, silent. The outside world could not know. The enemy's eyes must not see. Hours passed. Then suddenly, a cry. Soft at first. Then bold. The unmistakable sound of a baby's first breath, a sound both heavenly and defiant. A baby boy. Shiphrah held him tenderly, her eyes moist with wonder. He was so small, yet his presence was overwhelming. As she wrapped him, a tear slipped down her cheek. Another son saved, Puah whispered. Jochebed reached out, tears of relief and love streaming down her face. His name will be Moses, she said softly, almost prophetically, though she would not choose that name herself. Drawn from the water. Even now, she knew she held more than a son, she held a calling. A story God himself would write, but danger was ever near. Just days before, soldiers patrolled the neighborhood, hunting for expectant mothers. Some children had already been discovered, torn from their parents' arms. The cries of those moments still hung in the air like ghosts. Yet, Shiphrah and Puah kept going. They risked their own lives, their own safety, for the sake of the innocent. They drew strength from every child they swaddled. Their hands were stained, not with blood, but with purpose. There were moments, though, when fear crept in. One night, Puah sat alone on the floor of her home, her head bowed. She looked at her own empty hearth, feeling the loneliness of a woman without children, yet helping so many others bring theirs into the world. Lord, she whispered, am I only a channel for life? Will I ever hold a child of my own? The wind rustled the door flap. Silence followed. But her heart was stirred. Your faithfulness is not in vain, the Spirit of God seemed to say. And indeed, the scripture would later confirm it. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Exodus 1 verse 21. Their obedience was not forgotten. Their sacrifice, not overlooked. Meanwhile, among the Hebrew women, a quiet courage began to rise. They whispered among themselves. Yahweh sees us. He hears our cries. He is still the God who delivers. With every birth, the enemy's plans were thwarted, not by armies, but by women. Women who feared God more than death. Women who believed that life is a gift from the Almighty, even in the darkest of days. Their story was not just about physical birth, it was about spiritual birth. Faith being born in the most unlikely places. Strength being formed in the hearts of the weak. Deliverance starting in the hands of those the world ignored, and as little boys grew, as mothers cradled their sons in the hush of night, something was shifting in the heavens. Egypt did not yet know, but God was already on the move. The battle line was drawn, not by swords or chariots, but by 2 midwives and a nation of prayed-up mothers. The night was thick and heavy, shrouded in the deep stillness that only comes when danger lurks close. On this particular night in Goshen, the moon hid behind clouds, and the stars were veiled, as though creation itself held its breath. Inside a modest hut of clay and straw, a young Hebrew woman named Elisheba lay on a mat of woven reeds. Beads of sweat rolled down her temples. She clutched a worn blanket to her chest, inhaling deeply through every wave of labor that tore through her body. It was not just fear of the pain that gripped her, it was fear of discovery. Her husband, Ezra, was outside, disguised as a gatherer in the shadows, keeping an eye out for Egyptian patrols. Their first child had been a girl. Precious, full of laughter. But now, a second child, and they knew not if it would be boy or girl. The uncertainty weighed on them like a stone. Shiphrah and Puah quietly entered the room. They had walked barefoot through back alleys, maneuvering through the night like shadows themselves. Shiphrah, with her calming voice and wrinkled hands, knelt beside Elisheba. "Breathe, dear one," she whispered. "You are not alone. God is here." Elisheba's eyes moved from the midwives to the low clay walls. The smell of oil-soaked linen and herbs filled the room. The familiar magic of birth began to unfold, the ancient dance between life and the body. Everything in that moment was sacred. There was no cradle ready. No olive oil lamp burning for guests. Just quiet fear cloaked in whispered faith. As the baby neared the moment of entry into the world, the wind howled outside. Elisheba cried out in one final push. Then, silence. A moment so breathless, it felt like the world stopped moving. And then, a cry. Sharp. Fierce. Alive. The child was a boy. Ezra burst into the room, eyes wide with tears and fear. His hands trembled as he hovered near the door. "Is he?" Ezra mouthed the words, unable to finish the thought. Puah looked into his eyes and nodded slowly, a hint of a smile softening her face. The child, small, squirming, red, was alive. He was safe. For now. Elisheba gazed at her son, tears streaming down her tired face. As his tiny hand clutched her finger, a wave of love swept over her, love stronger than terror, greater than Pharaoh's decree. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible. "Yahweh, thank you." But there was no time for long prayers. The sound of marching in the distance snapped them back. The Egyptians were near. Shiphrah acted with the poise of a priestess and the urgency of a warrior. She swaddled the baby and handed him back to Elisheba. They whispered together, breath to breath, heart to heart. "Hide him until we return," Puah said firmly. "God will be his shield." Elisheba nodded. Ezra led the midwives toward a back exit, into the dark streets of Goshen. They would not go home, they would go to the next house, for there was always another mother waiting, another life at risk, another battle to be fought in the quiet places. As the soldiers drew near, Elisheba rocked her newborn gently, singing softly, "Though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me." And though her voice was shaking, her faith was strong. Strong like the Hebrew women whose legacy she now shared. Outside, the wind blew. Sand gathered. And in the shadows, courage continued to grow. The Egyptians might think they controlled the future, but they could not control the wombs of the Hebrew women. God was writing a story Pharaoh could not comprehend. Word spread through Goshen like a river in flood. The Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, they are vigorous. It started as a simple explanation from the lips of Shiphrah and Puah, but soon became a declaration of identity, what Pharaoh meant as accusation, God turned into a proclamation of destiny. Yes, the Hebrew women were vigorous. Not just in body, but in spirit. They were not fragile flowers, wilted by oppression. They were trees of righteousness, rooted deeply in their God. Their strength came not from herbs or diet, but from generations of prayer, obedience, and an unshakable awareness that they belonged to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In their homes, the birthing mats were soaked not just with sweat and pain, but with the presence of God. They prayed over swollen bellies. They sang hymns while grinding grain. They spoke courage into their daughters, and whispered faith into the ears of their unborn. Every Hebrew woman was a vessel of promise, whether she bore a child or not. Every woman held the history of her people in her bones. There was Dinah, a widow who never bore children but fed and housed the midwives when they came. She stood like a fortress, her home a secret refuge. There was Ahava, with a limp in her walk but fire in her voice, who sat by laboring women, singing psalms until the cry of new life filled the air. There was Keziah, a young midwife in training whose eyes sparkled with a hunger for God's purposes. She followed Shiphrah and Puah from home to home, learning more than medicine, learning faith in action. One afternoon, as Ahava taught a young girl to knead bread, she paused and looked out into the dusty street. A group of Hebrew women walked together, arms wrapped around each other, young mothers and elder grandmothers alike. Ahava smiled softly. "We are more than wombs," she said to the girl at her side. "We are warriors. We are worshippers. We carry more than children, we carry faith." And it was true. Many of the Hebrew women delivered children even before the midwives arrived, not because they were careless or wild, but because they were resilient. Even under the pain of oppression, their bodies responded to the timing God appointed. Some gave birth behind stables, others in fields where they gleaned grain. Some on boats by the Nile, others in the middle of the night, all while whispering the ancient words of their forefathers. Yahweh is faithful. And heaven took notice. God had been watching these women for generations. He saw every tear, every whispered prayer, every pain and every joy. And he was preparing to move, not just through the arm of a man, but through the faith of women. It was in the hands of these mothers, these midwives, that the first blows of Egypt's fall were struck. Not with swords or spears, but with courage. With birthing cries. With life. The Hebrew women, in their small homes and humble garments, were part of a cosmic rebellion against the darkness. Their arms rocked babies, but their faith was shaking kingdoms. God was preparing deliverance, and the midwives and mothers were his first warriors. Down the generations, their story would be whispered by mothers to daughters. We are the daughters of women who birthed in bondage. And yet we are the mothers of a people who walk in freedom. For the cry of one Hebrew woman in labor would echo into eternity. And one baby saved from Pharaoh's sword would lead his people out of Egypt. All because the women refused to surrender life. The desert wind blew harshly that day, scattering dust across the flat roofs of Goshen. Children chased after it, laughing in innocence, unaware of the silent war being waged for their lives. Inside a large tent near the edge of the settlement, Shiphrah and Puah sat with Keziah, the youngest midwife in training. The room was quiet, but tension hung like incense in the air. The women had been summoned again, this time not by mothers in labor, but by Pharaoh himself, again. The first summons had come months earlier, but this one felt different. More dangerous. The Egyptians were suspicious. Babies were still being born. Boys were still alive. The fear of the Hebrews had grown into obsession. Keziah looked to her mentors, trembling. "Do we have to go?" she whispered. Shiphrah nodded. "Yes. We are daughters of Israel. We don't run from truth." Puah added softly, "Remember, our God sees past Egypt's throne. His eye is on every woman, every child. Even us." They wrapped their cloaks around them and walked toward the palace once more, accompanied by stony-faced soldiers. The roads were filled with the groans of burdened slaves, the crack of whips, the clamor of a kingdom built on broken backs. Yet the midwives walked as those who belonged to a higher kingdom. At last, they stood again before Pharaoh, a man revered as a god among his people but who sat nervously now, as though something in the air unsettled him. His gold ornaments shone brightly, but his eyes were dark, calculating. He spoke with a harsh edge. "Why have you let the boys live?" Shiphrah stepped forward. Her voice was firm but gentle, like water smoothing stone. "The Hebrew women," she said, "are not like the women of Egypt. They are vigorous. They give birth before the midwives arrive." Pharaoh's advisors exchanged glances. The king found no fault in the words, yet he sensed resistance. Underneath Shiphrah's simple explanation lay a bold truth: these midwives feared no king but Yahweh. Still, his power was not absolute. God had already begun to harden the heart of Egypt so that his glory might be revealed. Pharaoh dismissed them once more, but his fury planted the seeds of a deeper cruelty in the days to come. What the midwives could not see was that behind Pharaoh's throne, in the spiritual realms, a war was raging. Angels stood guard over Israel's tents. Demonic powers stirred in the halls of Egypt. And in the quiet spaces of Goshen, women were bending the heavens with their prayers. The midwives left the palace with no promise of safety. But as they walked back through the dust, they lifted their eyes to the hills. He who keeps Israel, Puah whispered, will neither slumber nor sleep. They were known now. Their names were whispered among the Hebrews with honor. And in the courts of heaven, with delight. For their obedience, something unexpected began to happen. Just as God blessed the wombs of the women they protected, he began to bless the homes of Shiphrah and Puah. Keziah was the first to notice. One evening, she arrived to help with an urgent birth, and seeing Shiphrah's face, she laughed in shock. The wrinkles did not seem as deep. Her eyes, usually weary, were bright with a secret. "You," Keziah gasped, "you're glowing." Shiphrah placed a hand over her heart, then down to her stomach. "The Lord," she said softly, "has been gracious." Puah also received her own blessing in time, proof that God delighted not just in their work, but in their hearts. No act of faith goes unnoticed by God. No sacrifice is too small. And no womb is ever forgotten by the Creator. Night fell quietly over Goshen. A fragile peace rested over the camp like a soft veil, yet beneath the hush, hearts beat in uneasy rhythms. The Pharaoh's reign of terror persisted, and though the courage of Shiphrah and Puah burned brightly, the shadow of fear hovered closely behind every pregnant woman's hope. But the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had not forgotten his people. In the stillness of early dawn, a gentle stirring began to ripple through the heart of Israel, whispered among women at the well, exchanged softly between mothers who cradled their newborn sons. God was working. Even when they could not see it. One morning, Shiphrah arrived at a tent just as a laboring mother cried out in pain. Her waters had broken long before sunrise, and the child was coming faster than expected. Puah soon followed, calm and ready, a midwife's bag in hand. "God is with us," Puah whispered as she knelt beside the woman. The cries grew stronger. Another Hebrew son was safely born. Another life spared. Another victory over Pharaoh's command. In the midst of oppression, God gave strength, breath, and deliverance, again and again. Soon, it became widely known among the Egyptians. These Hebrew women are different. They give birth faster, before we can even arrive. What the enemy meant for harm, God turned into miraculous speed. But it wasn't just physical strength. It was faith-fueled resilience. These women prayed as they labored. They shouted the promises of God through grit and sweat. Their children came into the world under the sound of worship and whispers of hope, and then, a miracle that no one saw coming. One baby was born under especially peculiar circumstances. His mother, Jochebed, could feel that this child was set apart. From the moment she held him in her arms, she knew, God had marked him for greatness. Her eyes filled with tears, not just of joy but of fierce determination. "This boy will not die," she whispered. She hid him in the folds of her garments. For 3 months, she nursed and concealed him from Egyptian eyes, while Shiphrah and Puah continued risking their lives for every Hebrew birth. And God continued to multiply his people. No matter the burden. No matter the decree. The faith of the women prevailed. For in the invisible realm, God was weaving a story of deliverance. The days after her son's birth were golden but heavy with the weight of secrecy. Jochebed, the mother with the fierce eyes and gentle touch, lived between moments of triumphant joy and trembling fear. Her child, a baby boy so lovely it hurt to look at him, was growing stronger each day. But with every passing hour, so too did the danger. Egyptian soldiers roamed more boldly now. The cries of babies in Goshen meant life, but also risk. Jochebed's heart raced each time she heard horses in the distance. Every knock or stray shadow at her door sent chills through her body. Yet, she whispered the name of Yahweh over her son every night. The same God who formed the stars was forming a destiny within this little boy. Her humility hid a lioness's courage. 3 months passed. Her baby, whom she and her husband Amram called Tov, meaning good or beautiful, no longer stayed silent. His cries grew stronger. His presence now impossible to hide. One night, with a trembling heart and shaking hands, Jochebed knew what God was calling her to do. It wasn't to keep hiding. It was to let go. With the help of her daughter Miriam, she gathered a basket made of papyrus reeds. She smeared it with pitch and tar to make it waterproof, a tiny ark, of sorts. And then, at dawn, before anyone could see, she placed her precious son inside it. Jochebed pressed her lips on his forehead, her eyes full of faith and loss. Yahweh, I place him in your river, and in your hands. Miriam, not more than a young girl, watched from a distance as the Nile carried her brother onward, toward a future neither she nor her mother could see, but one God had already written. The baby floated gently in the river reeds, and soon, God's hand began to move the pieces of a grander plan. Even in heartbreak, God is present. Even in surrender, He is sovereign. Even when a mother lets go, God holds on. The basket floated gently on the calm surface of the Nile, rocking to the rhythm of the water's ancient flow. The river that had seen empires rise and fall now carried its most precious cargo, a Hebrew baby, uniquely chosen by God. Morning light stretched over the great river, filtering through the reeds and lotus flowers. In the distance, the elegant silhouette of Pharaoh's palace stood tall, its golden spires glistening. But God, in His sovereignty, walked softly through the still waters of the Nile that day. Just as the basket settled among the reeds near the riverbank, a young woman approached, Pharaoh's daughter. Her steps were gentle, her face radiant with grace. Surrounded by handmaidens, she made her way to bathe in the river. But her eyes were soon drawn to something unfamiliar amidst the plants, a basket. Curiosity led her closer. When she opened the lid, a gasp escaped her lips. There, wrapped in linen, was an innocent child, a beautiful baby boy. His cheeks flushing, his tiny mouth trembling, he began to cry. Pharaoh's daughter felt her heart move. "This must be one of the Hebrew children," she said softly. And in that moment, God's plan moved a step forward. For the heart of a princess would now protect the child Pharaoh had condemned. From the shadows, Miriam emerged bravely, the same little girl who had watched her brother's basket from the shore. "Shall I go find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you?" she asked, her voice steady despite her young age. The princess nodded, compassion blooming in her eyes. Go. Jochebed's world changed again that day. She would nurse her son, and be paid from the treasury of the very kingdom that sought to destroy him. That was God, turning ashes into beauty. Turning fear into favor. Turning mourning into motherhood restored. And so, the mother who let go by faith received her child back by grace. He would be named Moses, because I drew him out of the water. The palace of Pharaoh was a world unlike anything Moses had ever known, gleaming corridors, towering pillars, and courtyards filled with music, laughter, and the fragrance of lotus and myrrh. He was no longer swaddled in simple linens but draped in the fine fabrics of Egyptian royalty. Jewels adorned his arms, and servants bowed at his presence. Yet, deep inside the heart of this princely child, there was a whisper. A pull toward something greater than the treasures of Egypt. A knowing beyond logic, a call that stirred in his spirit. Moses grew in wisdom, favored by both God and the Egyptians. He was taught the arts of leadership, warfare, science, and speech. He walked the halls where rulers strategized, where nations were shaped through words and decrees. But some days, especially in quiet hours, he would slip out of the palace, wander toward the district of Goshen, and look upon the faces of the Hebrew slaves. Faces like his. Voices like his mother used to sing with. Hands stained with clay and straw. With every visit, the conflict grew within him. Was he a prince of Egypt, or a son of Israel? He remembered the stories. The songs his mother whispered over him. The unseen God who pulled him from the waters. And though he didn't yet know all the pieces of his calling, he knew this: he was not Egyptian. Meanwhile, in Goshen, the Hebrew women continued to labor in faith. Their sons carried the names of patriarchs. Their daughters carried the legacy of women like Shiphrah and Puah. The midwives who feared God more than kings. And God had not forgotten. The cries of his people were no longer just prayers in the wind. They were assembling. They were rising like incense. But before God would send deliverance, he was molding a deliverer. In the heart of the palace, in the mind of a prince, God was preparing a Hebrew boy to break the chains of his people. Moses had been delivered. So one day, he could deliver others. Years passed, and Moses' stature within the palace grew. He was seen as a future leader, trained by the finest minds of Egypt, promised a place among the elite. His steps were confident, his voice firm, his decisions respected. But his heart was a battlefield point. One day, he walked again among his people in Goshen. Their cries and struggles pierced him more deeply than ever before. A young man, his back bent under the weight of a brick-laden cart, caught Moses' eye. The Hebrew stumbled, and with a vicious lash, an Egyptian overseer struck him. Again. And again. Something snapped within Moses. This time, he couldn't walk away. He couldn't pretend not to see the injustice that pulsed through Egypt's veins. With a fierce urgency, Moses intervened. Words were exchanged, tempers ignited, then suddenly, fatal force. The Egyptian fell, lifeless in the sand. The overseer silenced, but so was the prince who struck him. Moses' heart raced. He buried the body, but he couldn't bury the truth. The next day, he tried to break up a fight between two Hebrews. "Who made you a ruler and judge over us?" one spat. "Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" His secret was out. In the palace, word reached Pharaoh's ears. His wrath was no longer reserved for nameless slaves, it was now hunting someone he had once called son. Moses fled. He left behind the gold, the privilege, the life he once knew. He walked into the wilderness with nothing but his breath and God's unspoken purpose. In the silence of sand and starlight, Moses would become more than a prince. He would become a man of God. And in the blood of that one Egyptian, Moses learned a defining truth. Deliverance would not come from human strength alone. It would come from the God of Israel who was raising up deliverers, through pain, through sacrifice, through faith. The wilderness had become Moses' teacher. In Midian, far from the noise of Egypt, he found a new rhythm. Shepherding sheep for his father-in-law, Jethro, he lived in obscurity. The wind replaced the courts of Pharaoh. Mountains, not marble floors, were now beneath his feet that he had traded a throne for solitude. But even in silence, God speaks. One vast and lonely afternoon, Moses led his flock to the far side of the wilderness. There, on the slopes of Mount Horeb, also called the Mountain of God, something caught his eye. A bush. It burned with flame. Yet, it was not consumed. A holy fire. A supernatural mystery. Drawn closer, his heart pounding, he approached. Moses. Moses. The voice called from the flames. He trembled. Here, in a place where heaven kissed earth, Moses heard the voice of Yahweh, the God of his ancestors, calling him by name. Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moses removed his sandals, falling to his knees, eyes wide with awe. And then God spoke what Moses had been waiting to hear for a lifetime, though he never knew he was waiting. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries. And I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt. Moses hesitated. He who had once felt the call of deliverance was now unsure, humbled by years of waiting. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And God replied with eternal assurance. I will be with you. Not just a mission. A partnership with the Almighty. The fire that burned without consuming became a symbol. A God who would not fail. A people who would not be destroyed. Moses left that mountain no longer a fugitive but a called man. Set aflame with purpose. Ready at last to become who he was always meant to be. The path back to Egypt was not just a journey, it was a transformation. Moses, once a prince, then a shepherd, now walked with the authority of God. His staff, once used for guiding sheep, had become a symbol of divine power. Beside him, his brother Aaron walked, summoned by God to be Moses' voice when his own grew weary. With each step, memories of the palace echoed, shadows of the past lingering in every dune and shoreline. But Moses' feet stayed sure, his heart anchored in the fire that had called him by name. Finally, the city of Pharaoh's power rose in the distance, its pyramids piercing the sky. The same palace that once housed him would now confront him. The same king who sought to kill him had been replaced, but the empire's pride still ran deep. Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh with boldness born of obedience. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go. Pharaoh sneered. Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? His heart was hardened. His mind set on control, not compassion. The chains around the Hebrews grew heavier. Their backs bent lower. And yet, God was not shaken. The same God who protected the Hebrew midwives and raised a deliverer would now show his mighty hand. Before long, Egypt would know. Yahweh is the God of heaven and earth. Through plagues of judgment, through rivers turned to blood, through darkness and hail, through power unmatched by magicians or kings, God was coming for his people. And in the sorrow of Goshen, hope began to flicker again. Mothers looked at their sons with renewed faith. Midwives remembered the God who blessed them for fearing him. The women of Israel strengthened their hands for the journey, and their hearts for the promise. The one who saw them in their affliction was now moving, through a flawed man named Moses. Through the wombs of brave mothers. Through the faith of women who delivered faster than fear could reach them. The time of deliverance was near. For when God calls, he also acts. The cries of Egypt pierced the night, but in the tents of Israel, a sacred hush settled like a blanket of peace. The final plague had come, death to every Egyptian firstborn, but the Hebrews, marked by the blood of the Lamb, were spared. Moses stood among his people as they prepared for the journey ahead. Their sandals strapped, their cloaks tucked, their bags filled with bread yet unleavened, for the God who delivers doesn't linger in places of bondage. The women moved with urgency and purpose, midwives, mothers, daughters, each one a living testimony of God's faithfulness. The same women who had once labored in fear now packed in faith. Their fast deliveries had been no myth, it was a miracle. For God was behind it, preparing them for such a time as this. Miriam, now older and wiser, took her place among them. As they walked out of Egypt, 600,000 strong, men, women, children, and cattle, she could see what her younger self had never imagined. The God who sees us, has come for us. They walked out of Egypt not as slaves, but as a nation. Not in weakness, but in wonder. Not in silence, but with songs. And soon, as they stood on the shores of the Red Sea, they watched its waters split wide open. The path of deliverance lay before them. Pharaoh's army fell behind them. The same Nile that once threatened their sons was now parting to save them. The faith of Hebrew women. The courage of midwives who feared God. The tears of mothers who trusted. The obedience of a man who once ran. All of it now woven into the tapestry of Israel's redemption. And when they crossed through, safe on the other side, Miriam, prophetess, sister, survivor, took a tambourine in her hand. The women followed her, dancing, singing aloud. Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and rider he has hurled into the sea. Their wombs had birthed a nation. Their stories had birthed a testimony. And this was just the beginning. For the God who delivered them then, is still delivering today. To every mother praying against fear, to every woman delivering in faith, to every believer waiting on a promise. His hand is still mighty. His love still endures. Subscribe to the channel for more Bible-based inspiration, stories of faith, and powerful content to uplift your spirit and journey. Your subscription helps this message reach others who need encouragement, especially mothers, believers, and dreamers just like you. Click subscribe, and join this growing family of faith.